Hello everyone, Juxtaposition here. Today's video will be entitled Valley Girls and Frank Zappa. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, it's time for me to take a dive into the CIA, crisis actor, operative, master of chaos and deception, Frank Zappa. Definitely more of a television social engineer than he was a musician, artist, composer, or whatever cover story you want to come up with for his banging kitchen pans and calling it music. It most definitely is a satire, it most definitely is a comedy, and it most definitely is not commercially successful. But you'll notice that Frank Zappa had a long and illustrious career until he died of prostate cancer at age 52, which is kind of young. And of course, he produced four children, the oldest being Moon Unit, who sang the lead on Valley Girls. Or was it Valley Girl? Which was referred to as Encino, a place where Moon Unit never lived. She always lived atop Laurel Canyon in two different houses. One of them being an 8,000 square foot beautiful home with a big underground facility basement known as the Vault. It's right across the street from Inger Stevens, who you might remember. It was around the corner from Abigail Folger on Woodstock Road. It was just down Woodrow Wilson Boulevard, Woodrow Wilson Drive from Natalie Wood's compound, where you might remember Cass Elliot moved into, at the exact same time that Frank Zappa moved into his big 8,000 square foot home on Woodrow Wilson Drive from the little teardown dump of a house at 2401 Laurel Canyon Boulevard. You know, around the time that Moon Unit was about 1 year old. I saw an interview where Moon Unit talked about playing on the property there at 2401 Laurel Canyon. Either she was lying or she has a hell of a memory for a 1 year old child who most certainly wouldn't have been crawling around in the weeds on that property, which is across the street from Harry Houdini's mansion, which is also in a various state of disrepair. All right, so anyway, what I want to tell you about Frank Zappa was, of course, he was born December 21st, 1940. He didn't come from under a rock. Oh no, he came from Army intelligence, where all my actors come from. You know, Abigail Folger came from Illuminati and CIA, OSS, State Department clearance's parents in the importation of coffee and in the ambassadorship of El Salvador. So you don't get to be a private banker with zero banking experience unless you're plugged into the network, right? And Sharon Tate doesn't get a television and film career unless her father is a colonel in the United States Army intelligence, right? And she doesn't appear on the cover of the Stars and Stripes magazine, April edition, 1960, unless Lou Brown, Nicole Brown's father, who's also in Army intelligence spycraft in Europe, and Paul Tate is in Army Intelligence Gladio Spycraft in Verona, Italy, NATO. And there's Nicole Brown Simpson's father working with Paul Tate, Sharon Tate's father, in Europe, in NATO Europe. The Army left behind. That's what Operation Gladio means. It's the Army left behind. And what kind of spook work could you possibly be doing? We're not at war, right? But no, the clandestine service and the bank anthropologists, they're always at war. 24/7, permanently. They're never not at war. We're always at war, we're never at peace. So don't be surprised when you learn that Sharon Tate got bayoneted 16 times from a NATO M7 bayonet, and then years later we learn that Nicole Brown Simpson had both of her carotid arteries slit on Bundy Drive in Santa Monica off of San Vicente Boulevard. And her father works for the CIA, essentially, works for Army intelligence, just like Sharon's father did. You know, the media's done a hell of a job of concealing the parents. Doris Tate and her crocodile tears, pimping out her daughter at beauty pageants from age 6 months. They made Doris Tate look like a real Sarah Bernhardt actress, didn't they? She's a real piece of work. And you know what? So's Frank Zappa. Frank Zappa isn't any different than Doris Tate, putting on a show, putting on an act, and it's not a musical act. It's not a musical act at all. It's an army intelligence, punk you out, fake you out, parallel narrative. That's the act. All right, so where did Frank Zappa come from originally? Well, he came from the Edgewood Bioweapons Laboratory in Maryland. In Maryland, back east. Frank Zappa was born in Baltimore, Maryland, and his name was Frank Vincent Zappa, named after his father, Francis Vincent Zappa, who was Sicilian and Napoleonic. And I'm trying to figure out here where exactly his father was born, and I do not have that information. Let me page down. Frank Zappa did not go to the Juilliard School like Neil Sedaka did. He was a self-taught composer and performer. That's sort of like I'm self-taught, right? I played the trumpet. I did have lessons. Frank Zappa had a diverse musical influence that led him to create music that was somewhat difficult to characterize. Well, I would characterize it as awful. Anyway, what do I know, right? I was a musician. I played in the Catholic Youth Orchestra. I was the number 2 trumpet player out of 75 trumpet players. So I guess I know something about music. Somehow I was in the second chair, and the guy next to me was 3 years older than me. So I was doing pretty good. Most of the guys sitting to my left were older than me also, but somehow I leapfrogged over them until I got braces. And that was the end of my trumpeting. I moved on to other activities that I threw myself into. Frank Zappa, unfortunately, had a difficult childhood because he had to grow up on the United States Army base known as Edgewood. Now, it's not just any Army base, it's where they experiment on Army soldiers using anthrax, specifically known as the Edgewood Arsenal Chemical Warfare Facility. It's known as the Aberdeen Proving Ground, run by U.S. Army. It's home to the mustard gas, which is stored on the base. This required the Frank Zappa family to maintain gas masks in their home. This traumatized young Frank Zappa from an early age because his father, who was a chemist for the United States Army, a teacher of chemistry and scientist for weapons, often referenced germs, germ warfare, anthrax, ailments, things that the defense industry would use throughout his work in the lab and the field. Frank Zappa's father also brought home mercury-filled laboratory equipment from the workplace, and he gave it to his young son, Frank Zappa, to play with. Frank said that as a child he used to play with mercury all the time, often putting the liquid mercury on the floor and using a hammer to spray the mercury droplets into a circular pattern, eventually encompassing the entire floor of Frank Zappa's bedroom. Childhood exposure to toxic chemicals, such as mercury, is known to increase the risk of developing prostate cancer, so they tell me. Hey, well, dumping aluminum and barium and titanium and lithium chemtrails over my head every day, like they're doing again on a Sunday, a beautiful Sunday, normally would have been a blue sky day, but it's a chemtrail gray day. That's, I think, could cause cancer also. Anyway, like I said, Frank Zappa ended up dying in 1993 at age 52. He was often sick as a child while he was there in Maryland off the Edgewood bioweapons base. He had symptoms of asthma, sinus infection problems, etc., etc. Anyway, his family then traveled. They left Maryland and the Edgewood bioweapons facility, and they went out to Mission Bay, San Diego, where Frank joined his first band in the Mission Bay High School Band of San Diego, near the Navy base in San Diego. His father was restationed there and reassigned to the United States Navy, where he taught, I assume, chemistry. Anyway, as a teenager, Frank Zappa was influenced by yada 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 groups. I don't think it really rubbed off on him. Anyway, in 1956, the Zappa family then moved from San Diego up to Lancaster, California. In case you don't know, that's Navy intelligence, CIA Spooksville, NASA, home to Edwards Air Force Base. That's nearby China Lake, weapons facility where they experiment using radio weaponry. You should know there's a monster borax mining facility there. That's where Charlie Manson was arrested for the last time for graffiti of the Bureau of Land Management Mojave Desert sign. And you know that's where this aluminum comes from. Aluminum is not a natural found material in the outdoors. You have to get bauxite, and then you have to go through a smelting process and extract the aluminum, which could be 56 to 60% of the borax, and you can convert that into aluminum, and then I guess you could put it in an airplane and dump it on your head and then hook you up to the 5G towers. Anyway, what I'm telling you is Frank Zappa's father was assigned to the Mojave Desert, to the Antelope Valley, and the aerospace industry. They found a home in Antelope Valley, which is adjacent to Lancaster. This is home to the SR-71 spy plane, which is now assigned to Palmdale, which is maybe 20 miles to the south of this area where Frank Zappa was. So every place that Frank Zappa was as a child was Army bioweapons facility, warfare arsenal. Then he went to the United States Navy, San Diego, okay, where he played in the high school band, Mission Bay High School. And then he sent back to the United States Air Force, to Edwards Air Force Base in the Mojave Desert, close to China Lake and close to where Charlie Manson ended up getting arrested eventually. Charlie Manson went wherever the CIA and military intelligence sent him. They owned him. So if you think he killed Sharon Tate, then you can blame that right squarely on the United States Army intelligence, because they fed him, they drove him around, they gave him the pen to write his poetry. He works for the Army, okay? That's who Charlie Maddox works for. There is no Manson. That's just on TV. Anyway, so when I tell you, Frank Zappa looks a lot like Charlie Miles Maddox, you know, because he's being run all over the country with his father, who works for Army intelligence. Yes, he does. And he's attached to the United States Navy and Air Force. So it's Army, Navy, Air Force. And there's young Frank. He attends Antelope Valley High School. He didn't finish Mission Bay because he got relocated. This is where he met a fellow by the name of Don Glenn Villay, who later changed his name to Don Van Villay, and adopted the stage name of Captain Beefheart. I'm going to skip over all this mendacity of how they create this musical background for Frank Zappa that never happened. It's very clear to me that some professional people provided whatever lyrics or tunes he was to play for his mothers of invention, and then they put him on the road, because this knucklehead would never have got a musical contract were it not for his Army intelligence background. That's how he got into CIA Hollywood. This is because his father was in Army intelligence. That's how Sharon Tate got in. That's how Abigail Folger got in. They were born into it. Frank Zappa was born into the CIA through no fault of his own and no initiation of his own. He didn't take the initiative at all. And he came to Los Angeles sometime in around 1962-63, which is the exact same time that Vito Palinkas arrives into town. You know, the first hippie, the first CIA hippie, the leader of the hippie movement. He arrives in Los Angeles simultaneously, as does Frank Zappa. And of course, they do meet each other through the clubs that were then opened along Sunset Boulevard in the later years. But first, Vito Palinkas was given provisional housing on the flats at the bottom of Laurel Canyon. And this is where Frank Zappa, I guess, went over to see the hippie movement. And they had a studio there where where the Byrds played in the basement, and I guess Frank Zappa played. So that's how they got to know each other and became acquainted. Then a few years later, in 1966, Adelaide Gale Slotman enters the picture at around age 21. In around 1966, she's 21 years old. And she is a so-called groupie for Vito Palinkas. And you have Frank Zappa is about 28 years old, 29 years old. Let's say he's 29. And he impregnates Gail Sloatman, which becomes Moon Unit. This is the first child, Moon Unit. Frank Zappa did have a first wife. He was only married 3 years and divorced by 1962-63. So Frank Zappa was footloose and fancy-free when he met Moon Unit's mother, Gail Sloatman. Anyway, he gets her pregnant pretty quickly. She supposedly was working on Sunset Boulevard as a secretary and also as a one of the troubadours for Vito Palinkas. And Palinkas is over at the Whiskey A Go-Go fairly regularly. Anyway, what I wanted to tell you is that Gail Sloatman is pregnant with Moon Unit, and they don't get married because Frank's pretty busy with his Mothers of Modern Invention or something like that. The Mothers of Invention, and they get a gig back in New York City. So basically, Frank Zappa and the pregnant Gail Sloatman, Adelaide Gail Sloatman, go back to New York. They're not married. And then 1 week before she gives birth to Moon Unit, they get married. They get married in late 1960. Well, let me see here. When was Moon Unit born? Because she's going to come into the story in a moment. Moon Unit was born September 28th, 1967. Right. And so 1 week before that, on September 21st, 1967, Frank Zappa weds the 51-week pregnant Gail Sloatman. He does the right thing just before Moon Unit gets born. I'm not kidding. I'm not making this up. Remember, they just met in 1966. She gets pregnant immediately, and then they get a gig in New York City, so they go back for that with the Mothers of Invention. And then Moon Unit is born in New York City while Frank is working in New York with his Mothers of Invention band. And then they return to Los Angeles, where they move into 2401 Laurel Canyon Boulevard in this tear-down dump of a house. But they're not there for very long because they're given an 8,000 square foot home located at Woodrow Wilson Drive. I'll be specific. 7885 Woodrow Wilson Drive. You can't miss it. It's across the street from Inger Stevens. She's going to get murdered in 1970 when she's the neighbor of Frank Zappa. But before that, Frank's other neighbor is Abigail Folger. Abigail Folger lives at 2774 Woodstock Road. Well, that's walking distance from Frank Zappa's 8,000 square foot home, where he's residing with Moon Unit and Gail Sloatman. And Abigail Folger gets bayoneted to death 28 times with a NATO bayonet, August 9th, 1969. And Frank Zappa is living like 4 houses away at 7885 Woodrow Wilson Drive. And yeah, that's where Natalie Wood lives. Natalie Wood lives at 7708 Woodrow Wilson Drive, just like about a half a mile down the road, Woodrow Wilson Drive. And she gets murdered, in Santa Catalina Harbor in 1981, whilst Frank Zappa continues to live at 7885 Wilson Drive. He dies in that home. He dies of his prostate cancer in that home. He never moves. In other words, they never moved to San Fernando Valley. They never moved to Encino. They never moved to Sherman Oaks. Moon Unit had to be exposed to the Sherman Oaks Mall when she was in junior high school. And that would be where she would learn the San Fernando vocabulary and nomenclature of a valley girl. Because you're not going to learn that in North Hollywood. You got to get on over to the porn area because it's the pornography area that speaks valley girl. And there's a whole bunch of colloquial terms I'm going to go through in a minute with you so you know what Valspeak is. Valspeak. Valley Girl vernacular. Anyway, who else have I got who died in the area? Oh, Cass Elliot, of course. Cass Elliot, who comes from, you know, Alexandria, Virginia, a military intelligence town, right? Anyway, so she lives in a small house across the street from Abigail Folger in an alpine upside down V-shaped home, alpine roof. And in 1968, she's repositioned into Natalie Wood's house. And they do musical chairs because at the same time, Frank Zappa has moved from the teardown on Laurel Canyon Boulevard into the 8,000 square foot home. So essentially, Cass Elliot, who is more or less the exact same age as is Frank Zappa. I mean, they're 2 years off. Okay, Frank Zappa is 2 years older than Cass Elliot. Okay, and Frank Zappa gets an 8,000 square foot home, and Cass Elliot gets about a 7,000 square foot home in 1968. Bang, bang. And neither one of them could afford that. Neither one of them was making enough money based on their careers at that time to live in those homes. And that's because those are free houses. They are assigned those homes. Got it? All right.